I'm going to pull that up so everybody can see it. For any of you who follow any of this stuff in the press, if you ever read anything in the LA Times, you ever read anything on NPR, you ever read anything regarding rent control rules, eviction moratoriums, the first person those people call up for the landlord perspective is Dan. So he really becomes the spokesman for us, for many of us who are in this business. And so it's really an honor to have him here today to be able to talk about these things. And we will of course have a Q&A afterwards with him. But this is an opportunity for him to talk a little bit about what's happening in the regulatory world, citywide, countywide, statewide.
All right, you want me to control this?
You can, or I can do it for you.
Okay, it might be easier if I could.
If you do it,
just look at it. So I just need to go.
Yeah.
Put this one.
Yep.
Go to the next one. All right, great. Well, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. Before I forget, I brought some of our association's magazines in case anybody would want those. And what I plan to do today is cover a number of regulations, both passed locally and at the state level, and then some pending regulations that seem to be working their way through the regulatory system. And hopefully after I'm done speaking, you guys will not go out and divest yourselves of all your multifamily properties. But once again, we have a very, very challenging year ahead of us on the regulation side. And hopefully you'll get an idea of what's going on in that landscape. That one. All right.
I think so. Oh, did it not? Maybe down? Oh, sorry. May have to just,
I'll blame it on you. There we go.
There you just,
so I just need to go like that. Okay.
Yeah.
The first thing you need to know is I'm not an attorney. I'm not giving you any type of legal advice. And my opinions are my own and not the opinions of the Apartment Association of Greater LA. As Will mentioned, I'm a recovering CPA, and this is very much my second encore career, which I like to call it. And I will let this person in.
Oh, we've got that.
You got that. Okay. Beautiful. All right.
So you just go aside.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. There you go.
All right. So our association, the Apartment Association of Greater LA, we cover Ventura, San Bernardino, and LA County. We're a member of the California Rental Housing Association, our statewide association. Also a member of the National Apartment Association. We've been around for 106 years now, and our goal is to provide education and increase professionalism in the multifamily housing industry. By the way, stop calling yourselves landlords. We're rental housing providers. Yes. The word landlord has very many negative connotations. Any word that has lord in it, like drug lord, warlord, stop using those words. You are a rental housing provider.
Some of the CDR contracts have changed to that now.
Yeah, we're trying to get the language changed in the California code as well. We got a bill passed last year to at least study that. We'll see if that makes any headway. But in any case, we have operational advisors. We have a full library of forms, virtually any kind of form or notice that you need, including a property manager agreement. We've got it if you need it for the rental housing business. And many of the forms are customized for different city ordinances. Probably the most important thing we do, aside from education and providing operational support and forms, is we're government advocates. We are, in a lot of cases, pure lobbyists. I have a local lobbying team that covers nearly 200 local jurisdictions, and we also have lobbyists in Sacramento, and we very much support our national association on federal efforts. You may have heard that the Biden administration is now looking at some tenant protections to be put in place from the federal government. Just what we need here in California is another layer of regulations. In fact, I was just in DC about a week and a half ago. We hit Capitol Hill and met with a number of staff members and elected officials to talk about some of the issues we have in California. So if you're not a member, please join. People ask how much it is. It's about the cost of dinner on a Saturday night with a decent bottle of wine. You can literally get in for a couple $100s. And I think it's well worth it. You get to talk to me and you get all kinds of sorts of resources that we offer people in the multifamily housing business. If you don't own rental property, I suggest you at least sign up for our emails. We'll keep you well updated on new regulations and other information that you need to know. So we've just gone through 3 years of horrendous COVID-related moratoriums. The last one ended on March 31st in the county of LA. There's still some hangover left out there, but there's still protections for unauthorized pets and additional occupants, but eventually those will expire. City of LA expired in January 31st, but then of course the county had to kick in for another couple of months, February or March this year. LA City still has a freeze on rent increases. So if you have an RSO property within the city limits of Los Angeles, you can't increase your rents until January 31st, 2024. That'll be nearly 4 years of not being able to increase rents during a period of inflationary pressures that we haven't seen in many, many years. There's still Ellis Act evictions can renew this month, starting April 1st. If you're not familiar with what the Ellis Act is, but that's a state law that allows you to go out of the rental housing business. For instance, if you're losing money and you just don't want to rent your property out and maybe redevelop it or convert it into condominiums. And the city of LA just passed a bunch of new tenant protections, and I'll go through those in detail. We are seeing an explosion, and I have no other way to describe it, in new rent controls and new tenant protection regulations. Cities like Claremont and Cudahy and Ojai, we're even hearing talk about a tenant bill of rights in the city of San Bernardino, places that we never thought we'd ever see any type of rent regulations, particularly ones as crazy as we have in LA and Santa Monica and Berkeley and other cities like that. But these smaller cities have decided to copy and knock off, some of the crazy cities like LA and Berkeley and implement their own ordinances because they want to protect their tenants, which tend to be the majority of people living in many of these communities. We are constantly getting new threats. There's talk about restricting our ability to screen tenants for things like credit history and criminal background. Cities like LA and others are funding private attorneys to represent tenants if they are facing eviction for any type of reason, whether they're conducting criminal activities or destroying property or even missing rent payments. The government wants to fund private attorneys. LA, for example, has a $38 million proposal to spend per year on private attorneys. There's a thing called a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. I think San Francisco may be the only city that passed that. San Jose attempted it this month and it failed miserably, which was great. But what that means is that if you want to sell your multifamily property, you'd have to first offer it to your tenants or a nonprofit organization designated by the government or some other type of government entity before you can sell it to any third parties. And so you'd have to hold your property off for sale for about 30 to 60 days, depending on the ordinance, and wait for an offer to come in from your tenants who apparently are struggling to pay your rent. Those types of laws, limit doing 1031 exchanges which have specific deadlines that you need to hit in order to successfully transact a 1031 exchange. So there's talk about it here in the county of LA and also the city of Los Angeles and also at the state level. In fact, we're facing a bill right now at the state level we're looking to oppose and hopefully not see the light of day. There's talk about providing cooling in multifamily along with heat and water and electricity. They would like to make that a habitability issue for us. So if we don't have air conditioners or ceiling fans, there's no carve out for the beach communities, which don't typically need these types of devices. We could be faced with installing those types of devices in our property. We're seeing more jurisdictions lower rent caps. Santa Monica has limited their rent increase to just 3%. Pasadena tenants got a ballot initiative passed and their rent increases are limited to 75% of inflation. And so we're seeing that more and more all over the place. Let's see if this goes. Oh, there it goes. All right. We're seeing more taxes and fees all over the place. LA increased their trash hauling fees by 200 to 400% a few years ago, and they continue to increase them by 6%, all while we can't increase our rent. So Just a lot of risks and pressure being put on rental property owners, and it's not going to stop. So we have a bunch of new laws that got passed this year. There's new requirement that became effective, passed in 2022, effective for this year. There's new requirements for ESAs. Somebody just can't write a note to your tenant and say that your tenant needs an ESA. They have to be a caregiver who's licensed and also has been seeing your tenant for at least 30 days. And there's a number of other requirements as well to sanction an ESA. EV chargers are now required in new multifamily developments. There's a thing called reusable tenant screening reports, and owners have an option to accept those under state law. However, the West Hollywood City Council just passed this week making reusable tenant screening reports a requirement. What those are is those are screening reports that a tenant pays for once, and they're good for 30 days. So a tenant doesn't have to keep on paying for application fees if they're applying to several different rental properties. And so basically you have to trust that these things aren't fraudulent, and you have to trust that the information doesn't go stale after a couple of weeks. But those are an option everywhere except West Hollywood, and I can assure you, you'll see other cities make these a requirement as well. There's a new affordable housing agency that got passed in LA County. What that means is a group of 21 people appointed to a board to figure out more taxes to fund affordable housing and deal with our homeless situation here in LA County. If you're a low-income renter, you're renting to a low-income renter, you can't prevent them from having pets in their unit under various circumstances. There's protections to victims of violence. If somebody is renting from you and they're a victim of some type of domestic violence or crime, they can literally get out of their lease in 15 days and you can't stop them. They just merely need to give you a 15-day notice and they're out of their lease. There's limitations on wage garnishments today. So in order to collect a judgment for money owed to you, it could take far longer. If you're owed $10,000 or $15,000, it could take you up to 20 years to collect that, depending on your tenant's income. We were successful in getting a number of ADU streamlining bills passed. The only way we see to help our members deal with this constant pressure being put on rent increases is to allow property owners to build more units on their property and increase their income. And one of the best ones that got passed is increase in the height limits allowed for ADUs from 16 feet to minimum of 18 feet. And hopefully that'll make ADU construction a little more palatable. But if your main house roof is up to 25 feet, you can actually go up to 25 feet for an ADU. That was a great bill that we got passed. And then, you know, we just don't sit back, obviously, and let bills get passed all over us. There are a number of bills that we did defeat. One of them was a statewide rental registry. For those of you on multifamily properties in West Hollywood or Santa Monica, Beverly Hills, LA, you're very familiar with what a rental registry is. Basically, it's a registry that forces you to disclose a bunch of confidential business information, including how much you're charging for your rents, how many bedrooms, who pays for utilities, and a number of other things. There was a gross receipts tax proposed. 25% of gross rents was proposed as a new tax. We were able to defeat that. Ban the box. We call it ban the box, but this would have forced multifamily property owners to remove the question from a rental application whether your applicant has been convicted of a felony. And fortunately, that went away. There was an attempt to force multifamily property owners to change the lighting at their properties to 100% LED, which would obviously have been very costly. Is there a way to get down, make sure I cover everything? I mentioned cooling in multifamily. Perfect. All right, thanks. And again, I mentioned prohibitions on credit history as well. Come on. Uh-oh. You gotta bear with me, I'm a PC user, so this is like challenging for me. There we go. So 2023, let me give you the good news. Everything I'm gonna talk about on the next two slides are just proposed bills. None of this stuff has been passed. There are some updates. These proposals are starting to go through committee, and from committee, they'll go to the floor of origin and then on to the other house and go through their committee process, and eventually the second house floor. And if passed, they'll go to the governor's desk for signature. There's 120 state legislators, there's 80 assembly members and 40 senators. I always think that they're just competing to get something out there, get these bills passed, or get some type of bills out there just to make themselves look good for their constituents. This year we saw over 2,600 proposals, and many of them are now working their way through the system. One, this AB 12 would limit security deposits to just 30 days. And we were completely opposed to that because, you know, sometimes owners want to give renter applicants a break. They may not make their credit requirements, but they seem like nice people and they're willing to accept them if they can get 60 days of a security deposit just in case they don't pay the rent. And unfortunately, this one is made it through committee and going to its house of origin, the floor of origin, and we'll see where it goes from there. The proposal to increase renters credit, anything that helps renters pay the bills, you know, we're in favor of, so that's a good thing. I mentioned there's another bill prohibiting use of credit history for people that receive vouchers, housing vouchers like Section 8 or VASH vouchers. Longer notice for rent increases. Today it's 30 days. 90 days if more than 10%. This proposal would make it a straight 90 days for any rent increases. Another prohibition of denying breeds. This bill would prohibit any type of discrimination over dog breeds, whether they're known to be vicious or not. I have a St. Bernard, so I'm kind of into this bill, but I know it'll be very challenging for many rental property owners. And what it's going to do is, because insurance companies will now have to insure all types of dog breeds, that everyone's insurance rates will go up. And insurance is already difficult if you have multifamily property in California. You should know that, particularly 5 or more units. It's been very, very difficult to get insurance on those properties. This one didn't go through AB 1086. It's apparently on a 2-year track, meaning we won't hear from it this year, but this was an idea to eavesdrop on rental property owners. They want to send out testers to properties and test you on fair housing rules. Basically ask questions to see if you say anything discriminatory. The problem with this is that in California, it takes 2 to tango if you want to record somebody. You have to have 2 people agree to it. And this would have been a one-way approval just for these testers to go out and try to trip you up and assess fines on you, possibly put you in jail. I mentioned the TOPA. It's also known as a COPA. TOPA is Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. COPA is a Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. There was this bill to limit mobile home rent increases to just 3%. And fortunately, that's gone away, but we were opposed to that as well, even though our members aren't involved in mobile homes, but we knew if this passed, it would soon come to rental property owners. The requirement was proposed for unbundled parking. This got modified, fortunately, but it's going to apply to new construction starting in 2025 of 16 or more units. Basically, what this does is it would force property owners to sell parking separately from the rental unit, and also require property owners to provide an annual study of market rates of parking in the area. And you have to give your tenant the right to choose whether they want parking or not, and whether they're willing to pay for it. There's also proposed funding for seismic retrofitting, $250 million. That bill got passed last year, but it wasn't funded. This would actually fund that bill to help people with engineering studies and things like that. This last one, AB 1620, what this would do is if you have, let's say you have a duplex upstairs and downstairs, and you have a tenant with disabilities, with mobility issues living upstairs, if the bottom unit should become available, you'd have to offer the upstairs tenant the right to move downstairs at the same rate. What the problem with this bill is that if you have remodeled the bottom unit, let's say you put $30,000, $50,000 into remodeling it, you basically have no choice. You'd have to offer this tenant upstairs paying far less rent the right to move down to that unit. So we are opposing that as well. There we go, it worked. Bill to increase small claims limits, so you can go and collect up to $25,000 in rent. Proposal for a statewide eviction database. This one's kind of stalled. We were against it because we figured the state, if they got this information, would only use it against us. Another bill to limit inquiring about credit histories. This next one, SB 466, it just went through its second committee hearing yesterday. This is a very, very unfortunate bill. Basically, it expands local rent control. If you're familiar with how rent control works here in California, there is state rent control and there's local rent control. And for the first 15 years of a property's life, first 15 years after construction, these properties are exempt from local rent control. Then from 1995 until that, 15-year period, properties go under state rent control. And then before that, 95 and before, or in the case of the city of Los Angeles, which passed its rent control law in 1978, the city of LA can only cover properties built up to 1978. Well, what this does is it does away with the whole thing. And there's a 28-year rolling period, and eventually it'll pick up all the state rent control properties and put them under local rent control. So starting next year, properties built in 1996 and before could be put under local rent control. And of course, local rent control is far more restrictive than state rent control. State rent control allows you to increase up to 10% or 5% plus the change in inflation, whichever is lower. And under local rent control in the city of Los Angeles, you can increase rents, but they've typically been 3%. Santa Monica's 3%. And so they're obviously a lot lower. And this would really harm a lot of property owners if this is passed. So we'll see where that goes. We are fighting very hard against it. Another bill to eliminate a 12-month waiting period under state rent control before tenant protections kick in. The state law Assembly Bill 1482 was heavily negotiated by our industry. And what we were able to get in the bill, one of the things was a right to sort of test drive a tenant. And we tried to get 3 years, but we eventually got 12 months. And so within that 12-month period, tenants basically have no protections. If we don't like them for whatever reason, we could just evict them on a 60-day notice. And they want to do away with that 12-month waiting period under state law. A proposal to disclose all kinds of fees upfront in advertising. That means you could have to disclose how much you charge to replace a key, how much of a security deposit, how much of a screening fee, and a number of other things for storage or whatever thing you would charge at your rental property. You'd have to disclose it up front, or your tenant would not have to pay it down the road. Or if you try to charge them for it, you could probably face some type of fine for doing that. So obviously we are dead set against that. They want to change the 3-day notice. I'm sure you're familiar with 3-day notice to pay or quit. They want to make that 7 days, just continue and extend the eviction process for tenants that don't abide by their lease. There's another proposal, this new affordable housing tax to tax property once again. There was a wealth tax proposal. Fortunately, Governor Newsom is against that. So hopefully we'll see that go away. There's a fix to Prop 19, if you remember that reassessed property inherited by your descendants. And so this fix would be a $1 million carve out that wouldn't be reassessed if you were to pass on your property. And there's just a bunch of other bills. They want to protect castes, different castes, from discrimination, trauma kits at properties, limit screening fees to $30, and a number of other things. It just never stops about the creativity our legislators have up there in Sacramento. All right, so the city of LA just passed a bunch of new regulations, very complicated regulations, but they've expanded what's called just cause eviction rules to properties that are not covered by rent control. So properties that are not covered by rent control are newer properties, properties that were not covered by either state or local rent control. So properties that were built in the last 15 years, but it also includes single family homes and condominiums. Now your tenants in a single family home, and it could be a mansion in Brentwood or Bel Air, is now protected by these just cause eviction rules. And just cause eviction rules are broken into two parts. There's a no fault, which means you just want to get the tenant out because you want to move into the property, or the government tells you you can't rent the property anymore, or there's at fault eviction rules when you don't pay the rent or you have some kind of breach under your lease agreement. And so there's 14 reasons now you can evict tenants not covered by any type of rent control. There's this new relocation fee requirement that applies to non-rent controlled properties. If you're to give a rent increase above a certain amount and your tenant says, I can't afford it, within 15 days, they give you notice that they're moving out. If they actually move out, you'd have to pay them 3 months of fair market rent plus a little over $1,400 in moving fees. And then the latest one, another one, is a monetary threshold you need to meet before you can even start the eviction process. And that threshold is 1 month of fair market rent. Fair market rent, by the way, is an amount determined by HUD for your local area, the Housing and Urban Development Department. And for LA, it's $1,747 for 1 bedroom, $2,222 for 2 bedroom, and it goes up from there depending on the number of bedrooms. These last two items, the one requiring relocation fees if you give too high of a rent increase, and this monetary threshold, are subject matter of our latest lawsuit that we filed against the city of LA. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then if you do give a 3-day notice in the city of LA, by the way, to pay rent or quit, you also have to file that now with the city of LA's housing department. So don't forget to do that. It's very important. There's an email address you can use to file it, or a mailing address. And it's just another one of those gotchas that try to trip up rental property owners. And it's an affirmative defense. If you forget to do that, it's an affirmative defense for your tenant in an eviction proceeding. So
Quick question on that. Is it only for pay rent or quit, or is it for any 3-day notice?
just for pay rent or quit.
Just for pay rent or quit. Okay.
So I mentioned there's a number of other cities going rogue on us. Beverly Hills banned substantial remodels. You can't evict for that, so you kind of have to wait around until your tenant vacates the unit. Number of cities talking about rent control, like Buena Park and Burbank. Claremont's going with rent control pretty soon. They're starting to have discussions. Cudahy passed a rent control ordinance just the other day. And I mentioned LA City. I'm sure you're familiar with Measure ULA, the wonderful transfer tax. We are suing against that too. I'll talk about that a little bit more. LA is being very generous. They're trying to come up with a $10 million fund to help rental property owners, small rental property owners, when they're owed billions of dollars here in the state of California. And I mentioned the right to counsel, about spending $38 million on private attorneys to go against rental property owners. LA County, you can increase rent 3%, which is way below what their rent stabilization ordinance calls for, but that's in place through 2023. We'll see what they do in 2024. They also have a monetary threshold before you can start eviction proceedings, and it's very similar to the LA one, and they're looking to fund $45 million to assist rental property owners. $6 million, by the way, will go into administrative costs, so rental property owners only see $39 million of it. And you could see there's just a number of other cities that are looking at rent control or tenant protections. In Pasadena, by the way, which passed rent control by a ballot initiative, there is some talk. I spoke to one of the city council members the other day. There's some talk about applying for another ballot initiative to try to curtail some of the restrictions that got passed. We'll see if we can get some of that through. And, I kind of touched upon this stuff earlier, but again, we're going to see more and more lower rent caps. We're going to see other transfer fees and more taxes and increases in all types of city fees, restrictions on tenant screening, legal aid for tenants, TOPA or COPA, however you want to call it, and so forth and so on. One of the things that is very, very concerning is this whole concept of electrification and anti-carbon. There's a lot of talk going around the state, including in the city of LA, about forcing owners of existing properties to take out gas appliances. And at the state level, there's talk about prohibiting the sale of any more gas appliances. So if you're dryer or water heater were to break down, you'd have no way of replacing it. In California, you'd have to go with electric, which would require us to rewire our buildings, increase the electrical capacity at those buildings. It's all very expensive, particularly when you're under rent control. It just doesn't work at some point. And one of our biggest concerns is return of COVID type protections. We just had gone through 3 years of moratoriums, and who knows, we could have a bad flu or cold outbreak one year, and cities or the county tries to bring back some of these COVID protections. It seems like it could be a new tool in the toolbox for them. We've already had the county try to extend their moratoriums based on a homelessness crisis, which we've had in place now for several decades. So suddenly it's a crisis that requires moratoriums. A couple ballot initiatives you need to be aware of. You need to help us raise money to get these passed. There's the Taxpayer Protection Act, which if our lawsuit to overturn Measure ULA and the lawsuit to overturn a similar transfer tax in the city of Santa Monica fail, this ballot initiative would undo it. It requires a 2/3 vote for any type of new taxes, and it's retroactive to January 1st, 2022. And because Measure ULA did not pass by a 2/3 majority, it would basically cancel it out after 12 months of this measure's passage. And we're going to really try to get this passed. It'll really limit government's ability to pass new taxes, particularly property taxes on us, and also to assess new fees on property owners. And then if you were familiar with Props 10 and 21, Michael Weinstein, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, who does great healthcare work, but for some reason has a bone to pick with property owners. He is looking for a similar act to undo a state law called the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which basically this so-called Justice for Renters Act, he's out trying to get signatures today, but what this would do is it would return any decisions regarding rent control back to local jurisdictions. So what could happen is we could see what's called vacancy control again, where the government dictates the price of rental housing even upon a vacancy. And cities like Santa Monica and Berkeley once had those rules. In fact, there's a number of cities in California that have already passed ordinances that if the state law Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act is ever to go away, they'll immediately implement vacancy control. It's a huge issue. It could also allow local governments to implement local rent control on single family homes and condominiums and a number of other exempt properties. So if this were to pass like Props 10 and 21 before them, this is what we'd call a bankruptcy act for rental property owners. We would never, ever be able to keep up with our costs. And so huge issue. Look for these, and please, we're going to be putting out word to raise money. The last time on Props 10 and 21, our industry had to raise something like $70 to $80 million. We had to go 3-to-1 with the money that Weinstein was putting up to try to get it passed, and we'll have to do that again. It's the only way to win. And it's really a shame, our legislators wonder why rents keep going up. Well, we have more risk, more cost. It's very difficult to do business in the rental housing market in the state of California. It's very challenging. So I mentioned some lawsuits that we filed. In the past 3 years, we filed about 6 lawsuits. We filed lawsuits against LA City and the city of Beverly Hills to try to overturn their rental registries. Those were federal cases. Unfortunately, we didn't make traction with those and lost at the appeals court level. We also just filed a lawsuit with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association to try to overturn Measure ULA. We, under the LA City Charter, it's our contention that the LA City Council had no right to put that on the ballot. And you're starting to hear things in the news today that LA City is holding back collecting these transfer taxes because of that. There is some concern on their end about our lawsuit. And so we'll see where it goes. We are rushing into court, and we will be looking for a preliminary injunction. And so hopefully we'll get a hearing sometime in May or June on that. We also filed a lawsuit against those new tenant protections in the city of LA. We feel those are a violation of state law. We filed lawsuits against the city of LA and also the county of Los Angeles against their moratoriums. In the county case, we did get a preliminary injunction against the county. The judge ordered the county to stop enforcing the ordinance or rewrite it by December 1st of 2022. The county chose to rewrite it, but the judge did deem that the ordinance was what's called unconstitutionally vague. You literally, in reading the ordinance, you couldn't figure out as a landlord what your rights were. And what finally came out as a result is that owners, this entire time that ordinance had been in place, had been vague, that entire time owners did have a right to pursue evictions. It was up to the tenant to prove in court that they were COVID impacted every single month they missed a rent payment. And as a result, what's been happening is owners have been able to go in court. They have been able to win eviction cases because tenants have not been able to prove that they were COVID impacted, particularly those who didn't pay their rent for 1 or 2 years. Just really crazy stuff. So I always ask, and I make a pitch to please support our legal fund if you can, very important. We have political action committees that support candidates that are sympathetic to our cause, and also initiatives, and our AAGLA Issues PAC will be supporting supporting the Taxpayer Protection Act, and also opposing that latest Weinstein ballot initiative, and we'll be helping to raise money for statewide efforts on both of those. And if you are interested, again, please sign up for our emails, follow us on social media. And with that, I know that's a lot of information. I apologize for that. Again, magazines are up here, and I'm happy to take questions. Hopefully nobody fell asleep, but there's a lot going on out there.